So welcome today to the Council for Learning Outside the Classroom first masterclass on the spring theory. So we're really pleased to have you back. These masterclasses went really well last term, so we've scheduled a whole range of new ones for this term. So do after this one, please do go and take a look at the different classes that are going on over the next few weeks. There really is a whole range of different topics and things that we're going to be looking at. So today we're really pleased to be joined by Dawn Thomas. Dawn is from Nature Days, who offers bespoke educational field trips in and around the Gower Peninsula for junior schools, senior schools, colleges, etc. So really, really lovely area to be based in. I've got to say, very envious. One of my most favourite places. So Dawn's going to be taking through examples of what she's been doing and how she's been engaging with schools and with people. Yes, in terms of practicalities, if you have any questions as Dawn's going along, if you pop them into the chat function, then it's just easier because it's sometimes difficult to keep track of who is waving a hand around wanting to ask something. Have any questions, put them into the chat. If you have any technical problems, again, put it into chat. Emily and I will keep an eye on what's happening there, and then Dawn can just keep going with her presentation. If there is, for example, you can't see Dawn's presentation, yes, please do wave, we will check that. But yeah, any technical problems or any questions, put them into chat, and after Dawn finishes her presentation, we'll then go through the Q&A, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask her anything that comes to mind. All right. Well, Dawn, I think there's nothing more for me to say, but over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Justine. And thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint presentation which will be available afterwards. So if there's anything on it, then don't worry about writing it all down. It will be available. So as Justine said, my name is Dawn Thomas and I run Nature Days, which is an independent field study provision. And today what we're going to do is I'm going to try and help you to integrate your field trips more into the school learning. So a lot of people go on field trips. It could be something that they do just in their local area, or something going on a bus ride, or even a residential. But what I'm trying to do is to make sure that that is integrated into the planning and into the scheme of work. It's not something that you just think by the end of the term, oh gosh, we've got to go on a trip, we haven't done that yet. Something that you really do think about at the planning stage. And I'll try and give you some examples of how to make sure that you do that. Also trying to get progression within that field studies or within those trips, because it's quite often you do field trips, but you don't consider what you did in the previous field trip, so that you can ensure that you're progressing in the skills or the knowledge that the children are actually undertaking. And also, I'm going to give you some examples of things you could do just using your school grounds to try and upskill your students to prepare them for a field trip, and also use the stuff that they learnt on the field trip to make it a proper holistic experience, not something that you did one day and then you moved on to some different learning. So I've got a little video that I'll show you which gives you some practical ideas that you can use to help you to integrate it more. So this is the aim of the session today. I'm hopefully going to try and support teachers or anybody who's helping with home education at the moment, so it's kind of everybody, trying to make the most of your field visits, the way that you're actually trying to teach them as well, and also upskill, as I said. Trying to integrate your field studies more fully into your curriculum planning, so you're thinking about it from the onset, and try to connect those field trip experiences to what you're actually doing in school, whether that's outdoor learning in your outdoor space or the in-school learning as well. So making it a more holistic way of teaching. So who am I? My name's Dawn Thomas. I run a company called Nature Days. So I take field studies from nursery up to A-level out in the Gower. So as I'm very lucky to have such a huge, amazing range of habitats available to me. But what I do actually focus on is really creating a unique experience so that every field trip is different and it's tailored towards the skills and what is required by the learning outcomes from each individual school. On top of that, I also provide inset training for teachers to help them to use their school grounds and also to integrate the field work and that ethos and that progression in field studies and in learning outside into their school planning. So what we're going to look at now is we're going to just consider how your field trips can be used to the best of them. So thinking about how you actually prepare your students for that field work trip, but also how as a professional you're integrating it into your planning. So first of all, thinking about it as part of your planning. Now, I've got some examples in the next few slides of how you could actually do that. But if you're considering doing a field trip, it should be something that you have integrated and thought about throughout the planning of the topic that you're doing, or even into the whole of your year plan. So for example, if you're thinking about doing some work on habitats, then you've got to consider what's the habitat going to be like at that time of year. If you're going to be visiting a woodland or a river or the beach, then it's probably going to be much more exciting. There's going to be much more available to you if you consider doing those in the spring and the summer term. However, if you want to make it a more immersive environment, so say you're doing a story in literacy and it's all about visiting the Arctic, it might be a great idea to take them outside to visit in the winter months. And again, so making sure that it's planned into the time of year, which is the most relevant and the most involves it in, which would be better for going to those different environments, is really important as well. Also, consider it as part of the planning. So if you're including your students in your planning for the year, if they're involved, then ask them things like, where should we do this? Where could we find that? And try and get them to think about not just the school environment as the only place they can learn, so as the wider environments that are available to them as well. And then really importantly is looking at your school grounds, and your school grounds are a resource that you could use to teach not just about habitats, but you could also use it to upskill your students. You can also try and do a pilot of what you might do out in your school trip in your school grounds, so that when you get out into the field, you're using the time to the best of your ability. Because those field trips usually are quite tight in terms of time. And if you know you've got to get through certain amounts of things, if you've upskilled them, you've got their group sorted, you know what teamwork is, so they know who's got which role, then going out in the field, you could practice all that before you take them out on the field trip. It's also really important that you prepare your students so they understand what they're going to learn in that field trip. So are you trying to get them to be better geographers? Are you trying to make it an immersive experience so they can actually use that experience to build on some skills back in school? And if you make them aware of what they're going to do there, then it won't be such a shock to them, but also they'll understand the aim of it. And that's really important. So these are just some examples of ways in which you could integrate the outdoors and your field trips into your planning. So if you look at your long-term, medium-term and short-term planning, just see if there's any way that you could just slightly tweak it to make sure there's an opportunity for your trips on there. So this one here is just an example. And if you look at the bottom, there's just a box there that says outdoor opportunities. So you could just add that, and then that will just nudge you to remember about doing that when you're doing your planning at the initial concept, not at the end. Or you could signpost ways in which you could use the outdoors. So this could be something that you're trying to improve in your school. So you might think, right, we need to use the grounds better. We need to use our outdoor learning better, especially now when we realize that being outdoors is going to be so much better for the children's health and well-being, as well as obviously to reduce the risk of COVID. So being outdoors could be a way that you could then make this your numeracy, your literacy and all that just more real to these students. And by covering those in an outdoor setting, you're going to improve their health and well-being anyway. So coming up with some kind of signposting, looking at what you're doing and then saying, right, we could do that outside. But also, again, don't try and shoehorn it in either. Try and think about your grounds as a resource. So do you think that this would be taught better outside? If so, yes, take it outside. If you think you take that outside, you're just going to have paper flying everywhere, and in the end, the students aren't going to learn anything, then keep it inside. But consider the location as a resource to improve and increase the learning ability of your children. Some children learn better outside than inside, so give everybody that chance to be in that immersive experience. Also, it provides a real environment. So you're really testing things they've done in class. So you might have done some numeracy and some maths context inside in class. You can take them out, put it into a real environment and test whether they do actually have that understanding when you put it in context. Another really useful way of thinking about planning outdoors into your planning is to look at your school grounds. I really recommend, if you can possibly, make a map of your school grounds. It's a really good way of really thinking about it as a resource. So just consider, now this is just a Google Maps, this is just from Google Earth, so you just have to print that off. That's all you really need if you want just a map to start with. But just consider, what could you do with the space that you've got? And how can you link that in to the field trips that you're doing? And is there anything in your school grounds that is comparable to where you are going or in contrast to it? But you could use that to exemplify what you're doing in class. For example, if you're teaching mathematical context in class, if you look at your school grounds and you think, wait a minute, we've been doing all about perimeter, etc. We've got some great examples here on our school playground. Then we can bring that outside to test their understanding of the concept. When we go on our field trip, we might have a completely different environment. If we could get a map of that environment, we could start to test some different scale, maybe. We could get them to start thinking about what's the perimeter of the area that we're going to visit, either the building or in the shapes that we're looking at from the air. So you've got so much that you can do as a comparison between those two areas. Again, if you're looking at doing data collection in your on your field trip, there will be somewhere in your school grounds where you can do data collection. So it could be just a bush, could be a tree, could be the grass, but it provides you with an opportunity to teach them skills so that when they do some data collecting in their school grounds, you've got them upskilled. So when they go out into the field trip, they do the same data collection and they're going to be really efficient, and you'll get more collection done quicker and they'll have more time to explore that environment as well. You can also think about how you could collect data in the field in your school grounds that you can compare to what you might collect out on your field trip. So you may have a field that's manicured compared to a meadow that you might visit when you're on a field trip. If you collect the same data from those two places, you could do a really good scientific comparison between those two areas. Also, upskilling them in just being able to cope with being outside is really important. So if they learn that if they haven't got the right clothes, it's not very pleasant in your school ground, it's probably a good place to learn it, probably better than learning it when they're on a field trip or when there was a residential. So learning things like how many layers to wear, whether to keep my hat on, whether waterproof is good in the rain, better to learn that in your school grounds. And then when you go on your field trip, they'll be prepared to bring the right equipment and wear it. But also, don't just think about your school grounds. You've also got your hyperlocal area. So this is just areas that you could walk to from your school. Now, a lot of schools now have got a form that goes home with their students when they start in the school to give them permission to actually go on just those hyper-local field trips. So you do not have to get permission necessarily to take them off site. So you could just walk them to that local area. So again, look at your Google Earth, consider what have you got in that area that you could visit safely, that's suitable, that's appropriate, and also that links in with what you're doing in class. And again, can we use that to collect data or to provide some comparative habitats? It's also really great if you could encompass also the places where your students actually live. So you're then making what they're learning really relevant to their local space. Because it's great to come to Gower and do an amazing field trip and see all these amazing habitats. But then if you go back to your school and they go back home, they may feel cut off and it's like, this isn't relevant to me because I don't live there. If you can draw that back in and say, right, we went to this habitat and we found these species. Should we see if we've got them in our school grounds as well? Or maybe even in your local field, in a common or in your local park. And you're making sure that they have that connection then with the area that they visited. So they don't feel that that's just somewhere they visited. It's actually part of the whole ecosystem that we're sharing together. So thinking about where you could visit on a local scale as well. If you're thinking about your field work in isolation, then you really are missing a trick. There's so many things that you're undertaking in your school, inside your teaching, that takes up a lot of time. If you don't link in the field trip to that, then you're missing out on trying to develop the skills they've learnt in the classroom into your field trip and onto your outdoor learning. So try and think about what they're doing in class. Is there any way that we can use this field trip to either test their understanding of concepts, or maybe we could use it to build on skills that we've done in class? Now, if you're taking a field trip yourself as a teacher, then you know exactly what they've done in class. so you can understand where you think they might have issues. So when you go on your field trip, you could think, right, let me just test this in a different context to see if they actually understand the concept that we were doing in class. And if they can demonstrate understanding in a different context, then you know that they've got a really broad understanding of it. So taking them to a unique place that they've never seen before is a really good way of testing their understanding of their in-school. Other ways in which we could build on the skills, this is things you could do either after well, all of these are actually things you can do after you've come back from your field trip. Data. So if you collect data on your field trip, it's really useful if you do something with that data. Unfortunately, quite a lot of people come back from a field trip and just write a recount of the day. Now, I've got nothing against recounts of the day, but just writing a recount of the day is probably the smallest thing that you can do. Think about all of that whole day. What did you do? What skills have you learnt? What data have you collected? Probably if it's a geography or if it's a science field trip, you will have collected some data. So that data is going to be utterly meaningless if you then bring it back from school, from the field trip to school, and you don't do anything with it. So think about some of the mathematical skills you can do. So you could do some graphing, you could do some data analysis, so you can do some calculating of some mean or mean averages. And again, this is testing skills that they might have done in class, but you're using real data. So although they may be fine with doing graphs, usually the data you collect in the field is messy. So it's not going to be a perfect straight line. So it really gets them to test their skills in data processing and data presentation. So using real data, they can then analyze the data by saying, right, this didn't work. And they know why it didn't work because they were there, they collected it, they were actually part of the process. So it's much more meaningful for them to come up with conclusions as well. If you've got data, you can compare it, like I said before. If you look at your grounds, just doesn't have to be exactly the same as where you went to. It doesn't have to be exactly the same actual sample technique or the same equipment, but any way that you can get some data which is comparable to what you found on your field trip will again bring it back so that they understand there is a connection between their local area and where they went for their visit. Thinking about doing a skills audit is a really good way of making sure that you are undertaking progression in your field trips. So think about what skills they developed while they were on that field trip. And once you've identified what they've either just started out with or they're developing or mastered, you can then consider the next time they go on a field trip, how we can integrate progression in those skills. Now, it could be fieldwork skills, but it could also be social skills, or it could be any skills at all, any practical skills that you're doing. So consider moving along from them when you do your next field trip. So for example, if you're going on a field trip in year 5, consider the skills that they're starting to develop or they've started learning. When they go on a field trip in year 6, how can we build on those skills so that we make sure there is progression? And if you're a primary school teacher, this is a lot easier because, of course, you can integrate all of the different cross-curricular subjects and you can develop the whole child then because you've got to see all aspects of it. Secondary school, it's a bit trickier because, of course, you've only got them for that one subject. But again, you can still assume that when they get to year 8 or from year 7, you can still establish what skills they should have developed in the previous field trip and make sure you build on them when you go on to the next field trip. Also, thinking about the questions that have arisen. Before you went on a field trip, if you've done your planning and your children have taken part in that planning, they may have had some questions on that topic. When you've had the field trip, come back and see if any of those questions have been answered. If they have, highlight that to the children so they understand the value of the field trip. But also, was there more questions that arose after the field trip or during the field trip? And then if you take those and then integrate them into the planning for the rest of the term, then again, you're building on that experience and you can make sure that every part of the continuation of their learning is building on those things that they wanted to learn or they got interested in during that field trip. So it really means that they've got ownership over their learning. And then last one, where are you going to go next? This makes this whole planning, this whole planning a part of a cycle. So when you go on to your next topic, try and, if there's any way that we could move on from what they were learning, can the children choose their next topic based on what they learnt in the previous field trip, and where could that go next? So trying to integrate that into even more progressive skills, or just a different topic, go into a slightly different area, but trying to ensure that there is progression, because if you're going back to the same field trip in year 6 and year 5 and year 4, and they're just doing the same things, then really you're not making the most use of those field trips opportunities. Now, one thing that it'd be great if you could do, teachers are doing this all the time, they're mapping their skills throughout their planning. So if you could think about doing that with your fieldwork skills, again, you'd have a really good understanding of where your students are in terms of their skill in outdoor learning and in field studies, but also you can consider how you can link that together with your in-school learning, as well as using your school grounds. So if you can consider mapping the skills progression in some kind of planning, then you can think about the rest of the term, or even prior to going on your field trip, and how you can link it all together. So this is just a few that I just came up with going on a field trip, collecting data. Not only does that link into your topics if you're doing habitats and plants, etc., but it also could lead into some of your geographical concepts, such as navigation. And one of probably the easiest ways of upskilling your students when they're on a field trip, apart from the stuff you planned, is to add some amount of navigation. So even if it's just they know how to get there, they follow a map, they know where it is on a map. That's just enough. That's maybe to start with. But then later on, if they can consider planning the route themselves, thinking of the best way to get there, it's all part of the skills that they could learn through the whole of the process of doing a field trip. Also, if you are considering using an external provider to undertake your field trip, so you're coming along and you're bringing your class, but somebody else is leading it, it's a really good opportunity for you to actually observe your class's experience. And you can find out things like what they don't get, any misconceptions, any of those concepts that you taught in class that they're showing that they really don't understand, or anything that they've developed in that field trip that you hadn't planned for. And then they've suddenly got this skill that you can now use in class or back in school. So being an observer is really useful as well. If you're planning to take the field trip yourself, make sure your children are involved in the planning stage. A lot of planning is involved of your course. You've got to think about where you're going, think about your risk assessments, how you're going to get there, booking the bus. But if the children are involved in that, think about how many mathematical skills you could involve them with. So journey planning, you have obviously got the navigation, how they're going to get there, how long is it going to take, thinking about the speed of the bus, which route they're going to take, where they're going to park, how much money is it going to cost, you've got your parking fees, what about entrance into where you're going. Also, consider getting them involved in locating where they're going on the map so they can actually follow the route, but thinking about the carbon footprint. So how much carbon are you going to be creating going on this field trip using your bus? Then you could go back to school and look at the trees in your school grounds and see if you can find any trees that will actually absorb the amount of carbon that you've created by going on this field trip to try and offset your carbon footprint. And then that's a whole load of maths that you can bring in with that, but also this looking at sustainability as well. So lots of cross-curricular skills. Also, especially in primary, you can then link in any other cross-curricular activities that you're doing or other topics. So literacy, choosing your books based on where you're going for your field trip, using that experience as an inspiration for storytelling. So if you're going, you go on a field trip and it's all been planned and the weather is terrible, then obviously that's going to impact your day. But is there anything you can take from that experience? Maybe use that as a motivation to write a really inspirational story set in that conditions. And that will be a really telling story because they really would have been in that conditions and they really would have felt it. Also, going on field trips to new places is always going to increase the vocabulary and the communication skills and so many other skills such as resilience and risk management, organisation, not only for the teachers, of course, but also for the children as well. So there's so much that can be taken out of it. And really importantly, you've probably heard about the nature connectiveness and the fact that children now are not being connected to nature, but there has been a big boom in this over lockdown because it's the only thing people could actually do. And going on a field trip is a great way of connecting them to the nature, but also, again, really important that you bring that back into school so they don't feel that disconnect to the location where they went. It's really useful if you could get that sense of place for the location they went to, but then try and bring it back to them so they understand that it's not just that place that they visited, it's linked to where they are living as well. Ooh. Right, I've got some examples now. So what I've done is I've made a little video of some practical ideas of what you could do in your school grounds so that you could introduce skills and upskill your students before you go on a field trip, so that when they get out there, you can use the best use of your time. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to show you this film. It's about 10 minutes, so I hope that's all right. Hopefully you should be able to listen to it. And then when we finish with that, I'll just go through a few more examples before we just about finish off. So.
Communication with your external field studies provider is key to making the most of your field work. If you communicate with them what your learning objectives are, and you've got a really good idea of the outline for the day and the activities that are going to take place, then you can prepare your students much more effectively. And that means when you're on your field trip, you make better use of the location and also the time that you've got there. For example, if you're going to a location to undertake data collecting, and you're looking at a habitat and you're looking at the plants or the animals that are living there, then there's going to be some kind of methodology that they're going to use to collect that data, and probably some kind of sampling technique. If you get them to understand the process they're going to do before they go on site, either by practicing it, undertaking a pilot study, or just having a go with some comparative equipment, then they'll be much more confident in the field and they can use the time more effectively. Also, really important skills like working in teams, working out roles within those teams can be done before you get on site. So when they get on site, they're very effective and they can crack on straight away with doing their data collecting. A nice activity that you can do is looking at different ways you can sample plants inside your school grounds. And this can be something that you can repeat on your field trip. Most schools have got some bit of grass. Now, if you haven't got it in your school grounds, then you could go to a local park or just access a local field. Now, within that, you could use it as a pilot study, so like a practice or a dummy run of what you might do to measure the amount of diversity in the plants or animals in the location you're going to visit on your field trip. One way to do that is to use a sampling area. Now, you can just lay that out by putting out a tape measure. So here we have a grid laid out by 2 tape measures. And if you imagine that as a square, that is our sample area. And if you ask your students to collect the data for how many different plants or animals are within this square, they can then come up with an effective methodology to sample this site. Obviously, you cannot count them all, so they need to come up with a theory of how they make sure that every animal and plant gets an opportunity to be counted. This is what we call our sampling technique. And there are main ways of sampling, which you are going to use when you do your field trip, that you can practice here. You can use that to evaluate how good they are before you choose them to go out into the field. So one of the main ways of using our sampling is doing it randomly. Random sampling means that every part of this square has an equal chance of being measured. But if you say be random, then people will always be biased slightly. So if you try and get them to practice some random sampling, you can do that and you can find out why that is the best method. The way I get my students to undertake random sampling is by getting them to choose a random number from just a box of numbers. So I've got corks here, but you could use Numicon, you could use multi-link blocks, anything that you can use as a number. Then the number on that block will then tell them where they're going to locate themselves along one side of this axis. Their partner then chooses another block and then tries to locate themselves on the same place on the other side of the square. As they go towards each other, staying in line with that number, they will find their coordinate. That coordinate or that location is their place for doing their data collecting. So they can look in that area for mini beasts, or they can count the number of plants. But again, they need to have a sample area that's smaller than this big sample area to use. And of course, in the field, as scientists, we use quadrats. Now, chances are you won't have quadrats in school, but you might have hoops or anything that's just a set size. So lay that down where your coordinates are, and then within that sample square or that sample circle, you can pick out how many different mini beasts you find or how many different plants. The forms of sampling can also be practiced at school. So we can do our systematic sampling. So that's changes as we get further away from something or along a line or transect. So just lay out a tape measure. And then again, the students can decide whereabouts along that line to take their measurements. Do they do it every meter, every 20 meters? And then you can bring in some numeracy as well, because you can think about how big the area is you want to survey, and then how much time you've got. So therefore, how many of those locations you are actually going to cover in the time you've got in the field. So practice here, time how long it takes for you to do one quadrat in one location, and then work out in the time frame you've got how many of those sample sites you can actually cover in the time that you've got in the field. Another really good way of upskilling your students so that they're effective in their data collecting technique is to undertake an investigation or an inquiry in your school grounds. And now that can be of any subject at all. It's just getting them used to being outside, but also undertaking that inquiry by following through the process of it and also following that sampling technique and using the equipment. Equipment such as anemometers or thermometers can be bought relatively cheaply and can provide you with an opportunity to teach them fieldwork skills in your school grounds on a regular basis. Upskilling them in these skills means that when you're out in the field, they're competent as field workers. So you just take your anemometer or your thermometer and you find your tape measure or you lay out your transect and you measure every 10 meters and take those readings. Now, this is something that they can take in turns in their team, so they can all have the method. You can also look at the data. You can come up with what's wrong with it. You can evaluate the methodology that you're using or the sampling technique that you're using. And then you can come to the decision that when you're in the field, the transect doesn't work, or you need to do it in multiple times in order to get reliable data. All this experience will make them more effective field workers and provide them with understanding of the reliability of data and the fact that they need to repeat things. So it's all upskilling them to make your field work much more effective. Other field techniques that you can do in your school grounds is looking at soil analysis and also rain. So again, you could buy a rain gauge, but you could also just make your own rain gauge, and that's another activity you can do in school. So with all that data, not only have you upskilled them in their methodology, you've also got that data that you could use over time to create some great graphs. If you are undertaking data collection in a different habitat on your field trip, then you might like to come back to school and use the habitats that are in your local area, either in your school grounds or your hyperlocal area, or any green space, to do a comparative data collection technique. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly the same collection technique that you used in the field trip, but you can use whatever equipment you've got to create some comparative data. So, for example, if you were looking at some habitats such as sand dune systems or woodlands, you might want to compare them to what you have in your school grounds, such as you might have a hedgerow. If you just have a dustpan and brush, you can do some data collecting by putting this underneath some of the bushes and just sweeping some of the mini beasts into your dustpan, and therefore you can do a survey of what you've got living there. You also might have trees in your school grounds as well. If you've been looking at woodlands on your field trip, you can then repeat the same data collection techniques to the trees inside your school grounds to see if there's any difference in those habitats. Now, you may have comparable tree species, you may have very different ones, but it's all building on that experience on going on your field trip to generate a holistic look at the environment. So your field trip is not discrete from the learning that's going on within your school and your school grounds. If you visited a river on your field trip and you undertook a river study, then you might want to try and repeat what you did in your local area. There may be a small stream close to your school. You may have one in your local, hyperlocal area. To see if you can repeat some of that data collection and do a comparative study between the two rivers that you've looked at. If you haven't got access to a river, then you can try and recreate a model of the processes and the features of the river system that you visited. Let's put some soil in a tray and then dig out a river channel. Next, put a variety of stones along the river channel. Then place houses along the sides next to the river and far away. Lastly, add water to simulate a storm event and see what happens to the stones and to the houses. Make some predictions as to what you think will happen to the houses and to the stones. You can also try and help to reduce flooding by adding vegetation like trees or putting bushes along like lichen. If you want to measure your trees in your school ground, then you can use trigonometry to do this. This doesn't mean it has to be done by secondary school children. You can use it in primary with a very simple technique. Now, there's a great resource on the NRW, the Natural Resources Wales website, that will go through all of the methods you can do for measuring trees, their capacity to absorb carbon, but also how much biomass they have using this method. So what you need to do is just find a tree that you want to measure the height of, and then use a ruler and stand so that your ruler is the same height as the tree. Then get someone to stand at the bottom of the tree. Then the person who's holding the ruler needs to move it so that it's horizontal. Then get that person to walk away from the tree until they get to where the end of the ruler is. Now, if you measure where that person is to the end of the tree, to the bottom of the tree, then that is the height of your tree. Another method is using trigonometry to make sure that there is a 45-degree angle from the bottom of the ground to the direction in which you're pointing, you're looking up to the top of the tree. Now, that might sound complicated. You might think you need a clinometer or something to measure the angle, but all you need to do is look between your legs. So if you can look between your legs and see the top of the tree, then actually the distance from you to the base of the tree is the height of the tree.
Okay, I've put my, can you hear me again? Good, great. Well, hopefully that's given you some ideas of practical things. Now, some other things that you can do, I've got on this PowerPoint here. For example, if you're looking at animals or plants, if you can create your own ID guide based on what's in your school grounds, then again, you've created a resource that you could use in the lower school. So if you've got year sixes creating an ID guide for the invertebrates found in your school ground, you can then use it for the lower school to have a look and the mini beast hunt. And you may not have the same ID guides that you've used in your field trip, but you've created your own version of it. You could also create your own equipment to do some more field studies inside your school grounds. So you might not have an anemometer, but you could create a pinwheel, so you can use that to measure the wind speed. Also, you saw about the models. You could model the landscape that you visited. Developing navigation skills, map making. If you can make maps of your school grounds, then you can really upskill them in navigation. And I've done this with nursery all the way up to year 6. And there's a really good way of building in progression in navigation skills from nursery all the way up to year 6. And that's something you can really build on when you go on your field trips and through the schools. Different age groups by creating different maps which are appropriate to different age groups. Getting up to when you get to year 6, they've created a 2-scale map that you can actually do some proper orienteering with. You can measure perimeter, you can measure distances, and you can use that as a proper tool. And also, as I said in the film, lots of micro studies and stuff you can measure inside your school grounds that don't require you to get very expensive equipment. It's stuff you can actually make yourself or that you can actually buy for quite cheap. So those are hopefully some useful ideas that you can take back to school and you can have a look at and use in your school grounds to build up those skills in your to help you with your field trips. Oh. The next thing, these are just some ideas of things that I have created on Nature Days. So over lockdown, because obviously I couldn't take field trips, which is what we usually do at Nature Days, I've created a YouTube channel. So over lockdown, I started doing daily outdoor learning challenges. And now there's over 100 daily outdoor challenges on my YouTube channel. But these are all activities that can be undertaken by Key Stage 2 children or in foundation phase or foundation stage, done independently. And these are going to give you all ideas that you can use in your school grounds. They're based in your garden, just because that's where everybody is, but every single one of them can be taken place in your school grounds as well. And again, if you want to integrate those into your planning, that's great, because they can use them in their blended learning, they can use it as homework, and they're all relevant to whatever topic you've got. So as I said, there's 100, so, and they're free to use, so please do use them, tweet them and pass them to other people and use them in any way you like. I've also created some resources which are for sale on the Nature Days website. These are 50 cross-curricular curriculum linked independent outdoor learning challenges. Again, they are linked to all of the 6 AOLEs, which is the Welsh subjects that we have here. But what they are is providing independent study for Key Stage 2. But of course, you can use them in nursery or reception if they have some support, and they provide them with ideas and ways of exploring the grounds, which are all linked to different subjects. And then on our field trip, we've also, on our website, we've also got all the field trips that we provide, obviously here on Gower, but we do provide inset training as well to help you also to carry on with your outdoor learning and to provide you with more ideas of how to integrate it in to your school learning and trying to make the best use of your school grounds so that the children can get the best immersive experience. If you want any more details about anything, obviously there's my details there, my website and my Twitter handle and Facebook page. These at the moment, because we're in lockdown, there's going to be challenges going on the Facebook and the YouTube channel every single day. So there will be new loaded content every single day. But I think that's it really with me. So I'll stop sharing that. And any questions?
Hi, that was absolutely fascinating, Dawn. I do have to say, I'm just sat here. I wish you were at my children's school. They're really, really great. It's just so thorough, and it just shows you what you can achieve with very, very simple. And yeah, I like the clip that you had on the film, which was the plastic bottle, the rainwater measure, and I thought, oh God, that's so simple.
Yeah.
But there's brilliant ideas there. And what came through throughout your whole presentation is that idea of progression, progression, and not just progression across one school year, but into future school years as well, of thinking back what you did previously or what they will have done in the previous field trip or activity during school, and building on them. So it becomes sequential, and it gives children a greater depth of understanding and knowledge instead of just hopping from one subject to the next to in the new year where it starts and they don't see the progression themselves, so to speak, and actually make it a bit more obvious. So then can say yes, they can make those connections in their own mind. So that was really, really helpful. And also I like that the use of Google Maps. I hadn't thought about that, Google Earth, of being able to see not just your own physical site, but the wider site around you. Because I think often we take our own journey to school or to wherever, and we don't think of other areas around it. In fact, we don't live in that immediate locality, but just getting that wider perspective, you can actually see, oh, there is a woodland, 5-minute walk away from the school I hadn't realised, or there is this, pocket of green space, or a canal, or a river that because I approached the site from a certain area, I was never aware of. So
it's amazing what's hidden. What a great thing to do actually is, if you're going on a trip, is to get Google Earth on a big whiteboard and then show the school and then pan out and then go fly to the fieldwork site to get that sense of place. Because quite often children get off the bus in the fieldwork site and they could be in Outer Mongolia for all they know. They have no concept of, they've just been on the bus for hours, that's all they know. But getting them to connect where they've been to where they live is really important, I think, getting that sense of place. And Google Earth is brilliant for that.
That's a really, really good tip. And also, yes, if they've gone quite a distance, but also sometimes, even if, they've gone fairly short distance, but they know they've been on the bus, it's been a journey, and they may be in an environment, in a locality which is unfamiliar to them. But knowing that actually it was only 5 minutes from school, they can still see on Google Earth, they can still see their neighbourhood, and they can then see where they are, and that builds a connection with taking it back into the families and taking their families there as well, so they can say, no, it's actually only here. Because I know there's sometimes a nervousness within family to they're venturing into a space that they don't know about and they're unfamiliar with. So know that they're absolutely brilliant. Very.
And there's nothing better than your kids taking you to where they went on their field trip and explaining everything that they did and what they found, because it just shows how much they've got from it. And I think that's a fantastic extension of it, is to take the parents back to show them what they found. I think that's great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. If anyone has any particular questions, I mean, that was a really comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much, Dawn. If anyone has any questions, do either pop them in the chat or do put your camera on and give me a wave. We'd like to have you join in. We can see everyone here, so it would be lovely to have your comments. And if you've had any, if you've got any tips that you have or things that you found really make a difference, do share them with the group. It's so we all learn from each other, really. But yes, that was fantastic. And everyone, we will be sharing a copy of the presentation, as Emily said. So if there were areas which you didn't want to write everything down, I did see a lot of people writing away. If there's anything that you might have missed, you will get a full copy of the presentation, so you'll be able to catch up. If there's anything anyone would like either further thought on, or anything you'd like clarifying, please do pop your hand up in chat or put your hand up physically. It'd be really lovely to hear from you. Yeah, well, I think it's because it was such a good
presentation. Stunned silence.
Anne?
Yeah, Dawn, I'm just wondering, how much activity were you able to do any activity over lockdown to support those schools that were still open for children of key workers and things?
What I did, I couldn't go into the schools, obviously, because I was hoping that the plan was hopefully to get into schools and help them take the students out, but obviously that wasn't going to happen. But what I did do for a few schools was that they told me what subject they were doing, and then I filmed them a virtual field trip. So like one school said, oh, we're doing water. And I was like, oh, that's great, fine. I'll go to a river for you, which I felt a bit bad about. But what I did is I went to the river, videoed me doing the river study and doing a river dip, and then videoed the animals squirming around. And then they had ID guides and they were going to watch it and identify what was in there using the screen sort of thing. So, but also hopefully with the outdoor challenges, and I've had some feedback from lots of teachers now saying, oh, well, what we do is we set them one of those every week so that they're doing outdoor challenges. So although I'm not connecting myself to the schools, I'm connecting, with the YouTube channel, and then the teachers are using that to connect with the children. And I think that's been great because, especially now when it's quite hard to get them outside, all the activities are still linked to the weather. So like yesterday we were doing ice sculpting and things, so it's all dependent, and literally it's dependent on what the weather is outside my window, because it's happening that morning at my window. So it should be really relevant to schools that are discovering that snow's on the ground. It's like, yes, I've got snow on the ground, so we're doing a snow activity. But I don't necessarily get feedback as to how much is being used by the schools. It's just the odd teacher that says, thank you, we're doing it. Or last time I actually went into some schools in between the lockdowns. So when was that? September. And some of the children and some of the teachers were like, oh, it's you from the
telly.
The telly. So it's like, oh yes, so you have seen it, but they just don't comment. So that's the way I've tried to keep. The whole point of the YouTube channel was to try and support the teachers so that they could just do Dawn's challenge, just go and do that. Then they don't have to do any planning, and all they have to do is look at their work and go, wow, that's great, you've done whatever Dawn said to do. And it gives them, it's all curriculum linked, and it's all outdoor learning in a space which is your garden with very, very minimal equipment requirements, based on this time of year, whichever time of year that is. And also there's educational content, so I'm telling them things, but there's always a practical element, so they're always doing something outside, which I think, in terms of being home educated and blended learning, anything to get them outside is just a bonus, especially in this weather. So that's the way I did, apart from when I managed to get in.
And is it mainly the schools that you already had a relationship with, or has this enabled you to reach more schools?
I have no idea. I hope. In fact, my biggest fan is my sister's school, which is, yeah, probably because she's my sister, but she's in London, and her children, she's got 4 children, and they've been doing all the activities. So yeah, so she's been sharing it with her school as well. So I'm hoping that there are schools all over the place that now have seen it and gone, oh yes. And I've started sharing it with more platforms now, Learning Outside the Classroom and outdoor learning Facebook pages, just so that it's like, look, I've done this, please all use it, because it's better, the more the better, really.
Thank you for the tipping down, head down between the legs, because I didn't know that one. That's genius.
It's great. It's great.
Thank you. I'll shut up now.
It's fine.
Yeah, it is fantastic, and it is so kind of you to share your resources so freely as well. Giving teachers and families those opportunities of the individual challenges. It's great. It's something which, yes, trying to get, even from a personal point of view, trying to get my 2 outside in this cold weather is. I found this lockdown being a really real struggle. The last one, I think, because the weather was good. And it was a bit more relaxed. I think there was, schools were a little bit more relaxed about learning, so to speak. But this time it seemed to be a lot more Zoom school, a lot more, being sat at a desk or a table, staring at a screen. So it's great to have these resources, and you can just see how much it connects to so many different areas of the curriculum. And it really, really does fulfill the whole, communication, English, math, geography, science, nature, everything, all within one activity, and independent learning as well. It's really, really great. And yes, one thing I did want to I wrote a note of, which was, don't view field trips in isolation, which is something you really brought home on, is that they're not the cherry on the cake, so to speak. It should be integrated within the whole of the planning process. So yes, building up to it, but then also after it, building on it afterwards once you get back to school, so making it central, well, not central, but just a part, and then it doesn't become this big be all and end all, which I think is where some people get that nervousness around, we've got to do a school trip or whatever, and it becomes this big thing where then expectations of behaviour among children and everyone sees this, just elevates it. Whereas if it's just part of the learning experience, it's not such a big deal, so to speak, and it just becomes what we do within our learning program. So,
yes. And I think also, if you make it, I don't mind when people do the field trip, but if you make it at the end, it does, people kind of, yes, as you say, that's kind of like, right, if you misbehave, you won't be able to come on the trip. Yeah. And they also then try and shoehorn, let's have a bit of fun on this trip. So as well as us doing, in science investigation, we're going to go and have an ice cream, which is great. But it's like, okay, we've got 4 hours and you want to do a whole science investigation and have fun on the beach and have an ice cream. It's like, really, can't we do a field trip and then you come on another trip and do the fun on the beach? And, what's wrong with doing more than one? It's great. And also the 2 ways it tends to be is either they come first off and you're like, okay, what's your previous learning? What do you know? And they're like, they know nothing. They've not done this topic at all. They know nothing. And I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure they don't know nothing. But, this is great. This is going to set you up to do your planning. So we're starting off with explore this and then go home back to school and then come up with your learning. Great. Or the other one is, right, we know all this, we're coming out into the field to see it all in action. And those are 2 great ways of doing it. But I think there's almost a third way in the middle, where it's like, right, we've got a bit of skills, we know a bit of background, but we want to see what it's really like. And then when we know what it's really like, we can then continue our mastering of our skills back at school and then see how it connects to our school grounds. I've had people coming on their field trips on the last day of year 6. And to be honest, I'm like, we're doing data collecting here. I'm talking about you doing graphs and analysing your data. We haven't got time to do it in the field. You're not really going to get the most out of this because you're going into secondary school tomorrow. So, there are times and places where you need to think, right, where's going to be the best time to integrate this into my planning so that it integrates into the learning arc of these students and so that it makes the best use of it, and it means that I can get the best out of that day. Because that, you know, field trips are precious things. I think, you know, people with, you know, restrictions in the amount of time you can take them off timetable, obviously the cost of the buses and things. If you've only got such a small ones that you can do, really think, right, where is the best time to do this so that I can make the most of the experience and they can get the most out of it before and after. And that way, you know that that is a really good use of your time and your money.
I don't think you could have summed it up better, really, Dawn, and that's fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing so much with us. I for one, have got a lot from it. I'm pretty sure that everyone else here has. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Just to remind you, we do have an extensive program of masterclasses running throughout the spring term. So do take a look at our website and find another that you'd like to come along to. If you're a member of the LOtC, you can, of course, attend these webinars for free. And it's just a low cost if you aren't a member. So do have a look at becoming a member, because you can access a whole wealth of resources in addition to these masterclasses, from resource packs to regular updates to discounts, etc. So do have a look at our website and find out about joining us as a member. I forgot to mention at the beginning that Dawn is a LOtC Quality Badge holder. This means that she's met a certain level of accreditation in terms of her risk management and quality of learning provision. So if you are using an external provider for your field studies or your school trips or your learning, do make sure that you look for an LOtC Quality Badge holder. It's an accreditation that's been endorsed by government, and they do recommend that if you're using an external provider for your learning, you look for one with this accreditation. So thank you again for attending, and I very much look forward to seeing you at another webinar in the future. Thank you.